So, good morning, everyone. Thank you, or good afternoon, sorry. Thank you so much for joining me today, especially on this topic. I feel like right now it's such a unique time to be talking about DEI, for lack of a better phrase. But it is where we are, and it's really important that we continue to talk about this. Simply because if we're not talking about it, then it'll go the wrong way. Or at least I feel like if we're not talking about it, things will end up going the wrong way. So we've got commit to inclusion, building better open source culture. It's also known as why cutting DEI is a great plan if you love homogenous ideas, biased AI, and driving away awesome talent. So to open with, you might have already inferred this, but I'm a woman, a lady, if you will, and I've spent the past 20 years straddling either a career in technology or law enforcement. So it's a bit of a unique blend of where I've been from a career perspective. But aside from being a lady, I've also been called that chick, the girl who does OSINT, and the girl with the dragon tattoo. And that one's particularly hurtful because even though I have more than 40 tattoos, none of them has a dragon in it, and no one has ever taken the time to ask about any dragons in my tattoos. Um, Currently, I work in a space that's equal parts law enforcement and education. I work as a curriculum developer and instructor at the Ontario Police College, and my job is teaching police officers, both future and current police officers, about hate crime, extremism, and terrorism. So again, I'm often the only woman or one of a handful of women in the room, whether it be in the classroom, the meeting room, the cafeteria. And my team is mostly made up of white dudes named Mike, Dave, or Steve. My boss's name is Chris, and my boss's boss is named Mike. So whether it's in the classroom or the meeting room, I am often navigating spaces that have been built by men and for men. And we were told that tech was different, right? That this industry, unlike the rigid structures of law enforcement, was going to be very inclusive. It's going to welcome these diverse voices. It's going to champion women, especially women of color, trans folks, people with disabilities. There's going to be these lunch and learns and equity meetings and women-only retreats and yoga and menopause support. And there was going to be, so much support and so much inclusion that it was going to be coming out our ears. But what did that look like in practice? A room full of men. In this case, a room full of people so white, so middle-aged, we had a cycling club. This was when I worked at BlackBerry. So this was quite a while ago, granted. It was about 15 years ago. And when I moved into policing, the roles that I applied for were actually saying, we encourage applications from women and minorities. And it's the same story, right? Different industry, same story. And I want to say that the men in both of these environments, they were wonderful. They included me, even though I think it was only because I was the best at pub trivia, but I was part of the team. My voice mattered, my input mattered, my experiences seemed to matter as well. But I will be clear that I am a white woman, and a white woman with thin privilege, and a white woman with thin privilege and Canadian health and dental care. So I know I started much, much further ahead than others. But that doesn't change the weight that I'm carrying as a woman. It's this unspoken burden of not just proving my worth, but for every single woman who follows. And every time I start in one of these roles where I'm going to be the only one or the first one, in some cases, I was told by leadership that my colleagues were worried because I was a woman. And I found this really interesting, and I asked why. And the response was always, oh, well, they were kind of worried about what woman or what kind of woman you'd be or what you would be like. And we were worried that we'd have to stop swearing or saying the word dick because you were a girl. And I know that my boss didn't mean to stereotype me or diminish me to my gender and ignore all of the experience and education and skill that I had. But he did. And above that, as my manager, why wasn't he challenging anyone on that team, right? Why didn't he have my back? Why didn't he just say, well, I hired the right person for the job? And maybe my perspective as a woman was going to be really beneficial. And in fact, it was specifically when we had female targets. I could give particular insights into what their lifestyle might be like. The fact that I was also well into my 30s and he said I was a girl is a total other consideration that we won't get into this point. And in hearing that story, you would think that when compared to the paramilitary style of policing and the advanced and forward thinking of technology, I'd find so much less discrimination and outward hostility, in fact, in tech, especially considering all of those promises that were made. Well, it wasn't the case. I actually had this conversation with a boss of mine when I worked at AWS, and I said, actually, I've found more discrimination within tech than I did in policing, which was surprising to us both, frankly. And I thought that getting into open source might be different, and it was with my own team specifically because my leadership seemed to understand this idea of representation, that lived experiences translated into different ideas, different ways to approach problems. And my boss at AWS regularly said he only hires people smarter than himself, which seemed really hard to do, but I worked with brilliant people, so he couldn't have been that far off the mark. And our team was at first mostly men, and that's understandable. You have 3 or 4 people, you can't get 50-50 right away. But as time went on, we became almost 50-50. And when that's pretty impressive when you consider the space that we're taking care of here, right? We know that within open source, contributors are between 3 and 7% female. I found varying statistics. And female contributions are actually accepted at a higher rate than male contributors, 78% for women versus 74% for male, but only when their gender wasn't identifiable. So what does that mean? Well, women and minorities in tech spaces don't have to be good. We have to be better than our peers. And we also can't show up as we present ourselves, right? How many potentially brilliant developers or contributors are giving up because they were underestimated from the start? They weren't given the same mentorship as others, and they experienced hostility, whether it be intentionally or unintentionally, from those around them. And then we have companies co-signing these actions, right? And while it seems like DEI initiatives really started getting cut after the US government specifically said that they were cutting these programs, Shopify was actually an early adopter here. They ended their funding for employee resource groups in 2023, which affected support for Black, Latinx, 2S, LGBTQIA plus employees. They also went a step further and initiated layoffs, which supported Black and Indigenous merchants in 2024. 2025, as we know, we saw Meta disband the DEI team, and as a result, several DEI programs, including their diverse hiring and training initiatives, were gone. Amazon scaled back DEI efforts in 2025, which included removing references to DEI from its annual report, and they adjusted internal policies. Google is one of the more recent companies to announce rollbacks, with Alphabet removing most DEI references from the annual report, which used to include the statement, "We are committed to making diversity, equity, and inclusion part of everything we do and growing a workforce that is representative of the users we serve." That's not there anymore. An internal memo obtained by Wall Street Journal, Alphabet's chief people officer told employees, "We are a federal contractor and we're evaluating changes. So we're complying with recent executive orders on this topic. As a result, we will no longer have aspirational goals." What does that even mean? Well, I'll translate. DEI is no longer a priority. Hiring and promoting are shifting away from representation, and meritocracy is coming back. We know that working in tech, we need data to support initiatives, right? If we lack data because we're not tracking it, there's no benchmark. There's no accountability, no structured path towards improving representation. And without actual data, you can also claim that everything is great and no changes need to be made. Sorry, I just had to tell my kid to go away. I apologize. So without everything being recorded, again, we don't need to make changes because we can't prove that dismantling equity provisions made a difference to anything. Many companies are also making hiring targets to ensure that they attract and retain targets, but now without these goals, we're saying this isn't a concern anymore. The implication here is that DEI was artificially inflating representation, and then without it, hiring is going to be based on merit now. But we know that this is already going to ignore systemic barriers that have excluded groups from even getting their foot in the door. Statistics tell us that you're 50 to 60% more likely to get an interview if you have an Anglo-sounding name versus a traditionally Black or Muslim-sounding name. So when we're hiring on merit, we're not actually. You're saying, well, I'm a white cisgender 35-year-old male. This isn't going to affect me. Well, it's going to actually. Cutting these programs will affect you regardless because you're going to have less diverse talent, which translates into less competition, less innovation, and less exposure to new ideas, which is a horrible plan in tech. Biased AI, bad security, inaccessible products, and these aren't just issues for other people, right? A tech industry that is only serving a narrow demographic is one that eventually will fail everyone. And DEI initiatives don't just help marginalized groups, and people forget this. Do you like your parental leave, your mental health accommodations, your remote work flexibility? It's actually DEI that got you that. With all of these things, when innovation tanks, when people stop looking at different ways to solve problems, technology stagnates. Well, it's saving us money, people say, and it's not. The Harvard Business Review, McKinsey, and several other studies have found that diverse teams perform better. They innovate faster, and this one's a big one, they make companies more money. And even though there's evidence to prove that defunding strategies to hire, retain, and promote these diverse workforces are working, many companies are closing these doors on support. And as someone who now spends her days teaching police officers how to investigate hate-motivated incidents and how to develop connections and build trust with underrepresented communities, this shift in DEI strategies really struck a chord with me. And the reason for that is because domains focus on the treatment and representation of identifiable groups within society. In hate-motivated incidents that I teach folks how to investigate, the victim groups are overtly targeted, right? Hostility and violence. Conversely, in professional settings like the technology space, groups are also targeted, but in subtle ways, through exclusion, systemic biases, and now in underrepresentation. And when we examine the impacts of hate or bias-motivated incidents, we find these incidents have a much different impact, both emotionally, physically, and financially, than other incidents that are reported to police. And the reason for that is because these incidents go well beyond a personal level. And this is true through exclusion in our careers as well. It's not just about one person. It's about an entire community and how all of the people that identify as part of that community can feel targeted. In eliminating DEI, companies are actually doing more than just changing how they look at hiring practices, right? They're eliminating much needed voices. They're condoning acts that go beyond representation. They disempower communities, make people reconsider the spaces where they belong. And this is where you'd think companies would care because it hits their bottom line. They lose trust, not only with employees, but with customers as well. Collective disempowerment is from a criminological standpoint, having one incident that affects an entire community, even though maybe only one person is targeted. We can apply it in this space by understanding that every time a person is excluded from a space or has supports that champion their position taken away, it reinforces this narrative that those members of the community are no longer valued. And it doubles down on this sense of marginalization. Erosion of aspirations. We know that if someone is excluded from an event or intentionally left out of something, it can deter people from pursuing aspirational goals like a career in tech, or even leading people who are in tech to leaving them, which then perpetuates these cycles of underrepresentation. And of course, I have data to support that. 76% of job seekers consider workplace diversity an important factor when evaluating job offers. This was in 2019, and this is increasing as our workforce is starting to scale younger. Companies that are perceived as non-inclusive may also be less favorably viewed by both job seekers and consumers. Diminished trust is important, particularly in the open source community. We know that open source projects already struggle with having people support them. And if you're actively discouraging people from participating because they don't trust the intentions of these organizations supporting or benefiting from a project, why are they going to help it for free? And this looks like facial recognition failing people of color, medical AI misdiagnosing non-white patients. And if you have an accent and you've ever tried to use a voice assistant, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that certain communities aren't considered in the tech space. So how does all of this translate into open source communities? Well, first, let me say this about OS. This community is the only place I've been where it was actively encouraged that people dance with a suitcase. This was at Open Source Summit Europe several years ago in Valencia. I brought my partner, who was a career police officer, to an open source event a few years ago in British Columbia in Canada. But they were struck not just by the openness in a technical sense, but the sheer humanity of it. It was the most diverse group of people that he had ever been a part of. Open source is very unlike any other community that I've been part of. And I grew up doing musical theater. So even in those spaces, I never experienced the same kind of freedom of self that I see in open source. But that said, being welcoming by nature doesn't mean that we don't have work to do. And again, as a white cisgender woman, I have the freedom of moving very freely in these spaces. But I've also had conversations with people who, when I ask if they're going to a certain event, say, I can't go there. It won't be safe for me. And not because of logistics, cost, or timing, but because their religion, sexuality, gender expression, or skin color might make them a target in their environment. And that is a problem. Because when governments and corporations scale back any race inclusivity initiatives, they are not just making policies, they are making the world smaller for anyone who doesn't fit into their privileged definition of a valuable employee or a valuable person. And when the world shrinks for one person, it shrinks for all of us. And as members of the open source community, a space that thrives because of the diversity of its contributors, we have a responsibility to advocate for those who are being dismissed, avoided, and erased. We have to make sure that inclusion isn't just this unspoken ethos, but also an effort. Because truly open community isn't about open code, it's about opening doors. Open source has never waited for permission to innovate, lead, or do the opposite of what everyone else is doing. In fact, I would say that OS is known for not following the rules, right? We danced with suitcases after all. So is there any reason why this space, or any space really, should need permission to create these safe, inclusive spaces and opportunities for our brothers and sisters and non-binary individuals within this space? It's not enough to say anyone can join, or we don't believe in having a manel, right, an all-male panel. But unless you are actively inviting, mentoring, and amplifying these people who may not otherwise feel like they don't belong, then you're not really walking the walk. You don't need corporate's approval to do what's right. And down there at the bottom, I have an asterisk, unless you do, in which case, please don't come for me. So inclusion isn't extra work, right? People should feel safe and valued everywhere. If employers aren't endorsing inclusivity, then we in the community have to. Why does DEI need a separate team anyways, right? This is fundamental work. It should be normalized into contribution guides, project onboarding, tenets, codes of conduct, weaved into the fabric of our communities. And action is louder than inaction, right? Actively welcoming and supporting contributors from underrepresented groups is really important. And when I say what's happening in our spaces, I mean both physical and online spaces, right? These two environments bleed together. Obviously, we're doing it right now. So we need to choose event locations as well as event formats that are accessible and safe. So way to go, Fosback. This is fantastic. You've done a great job for doing this already. If someone says they can't attend an event because of safety concerns or inaccessibility issues or other challenges, first believe them and then work to find a solution and then bake it into your practice. It took one event for my team at AWS where someone with accessibility issues said that they were having challenges navigating floor space. And after that, my event planning partners and I considered that moving forward. It didn't take any extra effort, and it was actually kind of fun to consistently think through these different lenses. Solutions will always exist if you give yourself 15 minutes to chat with the people around you. Get data, use the data, make informed decisions. I'm pretty sure that's already part of all of our job descriptions, right? There's something about problem solving and thinking outside the box in there. You can apply that in so many ways. Also, we need to moderate these spaces actively. Free speech is a buzzword right now, and ironically, it seems to be talked about by people who seem to use it when they're worried about people having different opinions from theirs. But you need to make it clear that freedom of speech doesn't translate into freedom of consequence, right? We must make it clear that harassment, discrimination, bad faith discourse, those things are not going to be tolerated. But if open source is already struggling for support, how do we get more when we're not even funding the basics? That's understandable. So pushing for funding models that support marginalized contributors, these are important. But when DEI budgets are cut, those who rely on that financial support are first to leave. So amplify and credit the work from underrepresented contributors. If companies don't acknowledge that work, we can, right? Inclusion should be sustainable without relying on corporate buy-in. Language matters too. We don't need to get angry, we can get strategic. If we change the language around things, then we can suddenly shift and say, it's not DEI, it's security and talent pipelines and longevity. And we're funding healthier open source ecosystems, and we're supporting security and project stability. Many companies are hiring from open source, so they should be investing in this talent that they're recruiting from. And we know that projects that have a diverse contributor base are actually more strong than those who don't. So if we frame inclusion as a stability issue, companies might be more likely to pay attention. Marginalized contributors are already overrepresented in open source because traditional tech spaces exclude them, right? They're not welcome in other tech spaces, but open source, which is kind of interesting where we're not being paid, there's a bit of an overrepresentation there. But now that DEI budgets are getting cut or vanishing altogether, guess who's not getting funding, sponsorships, or leadership opportunities? The same people who have been keeping these projects alive. So we know that with open source being unpaid labor, there are certain groups that do already so much unpaid labor. And primarily these are excluded groups, which are women, our trans community, our Black, Indigenous, and person of color developers, and disabled people too, right? We talked already about women who are making up a very small portion, but contributing a lot within the open source space. This translates into women doing a lot of work, but not getting leadership, career advancement, or even credit for it, because again, their gender is being excluded from it. The trans community is sort of a really cool community within open source because approximately 1% of open source contributors identify as transgender. And this is actually slightly above their representation within the United States and Canadian populations, which means that our trans contributors are contributing at a higher rate than their actual representation in the population. If every demographic contributed to open source at the same rate as trans individuals, the ecosystem would be massively more robust and innovative. But the reality is that trans contributors are overrepresented in this space because they're facing higher barriers to inclusion. We need to examine this, right? The trans community is participating more in open source because they're relying on open source as an alternative to traditional employment. and this is usually because of workplace discrimination. Overrepresentation doesn't necessarily mean are trans people here, but what conditions are they working under? 5% of open source contributors are Black, despite making up 14% of the US population. And we know that many disabled contributors turn to open source work because flexible remote work and traditional tech jobs didn't accommodate right now. And especially with return to office mandates, we know that that is going to unequally challenge these groups already, particularly those in the disabled community. And we sure didn't have any things like a tampon dispenser in our undercover trailer, working with the police, me again being the only woman. So what does this mean moving forward? What can we do? Open source is often unpaid, and we know that this means that minority contributors aren't getting stable jobs or fair wages. So this is going to reinforce the need for more paid opportunities within open source. We need to push for this stuff because it's not going to happen organically. We know that Mozilla, Linux Foundation, NLNet, Comcast, etc., they're still supporting DEI initiatives, which is great. But we need to know that if our companies are giving money or donations to foundations or grants, we should know how they're going to be contributing that money. We can ask how it's going to be spent. Asking where your money is going is basically table stakes, in my opinion. And also, DEI doesn't die because a corporate memo says so, right? We need to build tech or inclusion, into tech, whether people like it or not. Even if companies cut DEI funding, we can still amplify, support, and mentor these underrepresented contributors. Watch for and call out performative DEI, right? Report hiring numbers, but ignoring leadership gaps and not addressing attrition, right? If you're saying we have this many people of this community within this space, that's great. But where are they in leadership roles? How many of those people left the organization? We need to talk about inclusion that builds AI models with biased outcomes as well, right? We need to start using models that are going to be useful to everyone and represent everyone. And if you're marketing to diverse consumers but not investing back into these communities, that should be called out too. We can also have DEI in our environmental, social, and governance reports. Generally, they demonstrate corporate responsibility, but we can leverage them that way as well. And most importantly, we need to know what kind of industry we're shaping, right? Is this an industry that values all talents? Are we okay losing contributors because we're not addressing the barriers that exist? Who defines merit within this space? And why are we measuring success by excluding other people? If we keep letting corporations take free labor from the most marginalized communities without giving anything back, open source is probably not going to have anything left for it, right? The future isn't just about diversity, right? This isn't just about diversity. Tech isn't about just diversity. This is about fairness and sustainability and the future of tech. So I hope that all of you have taken at least something from this and have understood that you yourself can be a one-person DEI team, and it's a very easy lift for you guys to champion the people within your communities, champion the people within your spaces. And it's only going to benefit open source because we know already that open source thrives on all of these diverse communities. And by supporting them and supporting them loudly is not only going to send a message to our community, but to other communities where these cuts or where people are taking funding and recognition away. Thank you so much.